Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the star of our show, Terry.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Music and Me. I'm your host, Terry, and today we're talking about one of the most inspiring and heartbreaking stories in musical theater. Let me start with a question that really makes you stop and think. What if the show that changed Broadway forever opened the night after you died? It sounds unbelievable, but that's exactly what happened to composer and playwright Jonathan Larson. I actually decided to do this episode after I watched the movie Tick, Tick, Boom on Netflix the other day. Watching that film reminded me just how powerful Jonathan Larson's story really is. And it also made me think again about Rent, which means so much to me personally because Rent was actually the very first Broadway show I ever saw. Experiencing that show for the first time completely changed the way I looked at musical theater. Jonathan Larson was a composer with a dream. He wanted to bring rock music, real-life struggles, and authentic stories to the Broadway stage. He believed musicals could be modern, emotional, and speak directly to what people were going through in their lives. So in today's episode, we're going to explore his incredible story and take a closer look at two of his most powerful works, Rent and Tick, Tick, Boom. Jonathan Larson may not have lived to see the incredible impact his work would have on Broadway, but his music, his passion, and his message are still inspiring audiences today. So, before we dive into Rent and Tick, Tick, Boom, let's talk about the man behind the music, Jonathan Larson himself. Jonathan Larson was born in 1960 in New York, and from a young age, he absolutely loved music and theater. But what made him different from a lot of other composers at the time was the kind of music he loved. He didn't just grow up listening to traditional Broadway shows, he was also deeply inspired by pop and rock music. Shows like West Side Story and Hair had a huge influence on him because they proved that musical theater could sound modern and speak to what was happening in the world right now. They weren't just entertaining, they were bold, emotional, and sometimes even rebellious. And that's exactly what Jonathan Larson wanted to do. His dream was to make musical theater feel alive again. He wanted Broadway to sound like the music people were actually listening to. He wanted stories about real people, real struggles, and real life. But like so many artists chasing a dream, the road to success was not easy. For years, Jonathan Larson worked as a waiter in New York City while he wrote music and submitted shows, hoping that someone in the theater world would give him a chance. Imagine spending your days serving food and your nights pouring your heart into songs and scripts, not knowing if anyone would ever hear them. That kind of struggle is something a lot of artists can relate to. The feeling of chasing a dream while the rest of the world keeps moving on around you. But Jonathan Larson never gave up on his dream. He kept writing, kept creating, and kept believing that musical theater could be something new, something exciting, and something that spoke to a whole new generation. Now, let's talk about Tick, Tick, Boom. Because this musical is really Jonathan Larson telling his own story. Before it became the movie that a lot of people discovered on Netflix, Tick, Tick, Boom actually started as a one-man rock monologue that Jonathan Larson performed himself. And honestly, it's basically a window straight into his life. The show follows a composer named John, spelled Jon, who is about to turn 30 and is having a full-on existential crisis. He's watching friends get stable jobs, move forward in their careers, and start their adult lives, while he's still waiting tables and trying to write the musical that he hopes will finally make it to Broadway. And the big question hanging over his head is something a lot of people have probably felt at some point. What if my dream never happens? One of the first songs in the show, 3090, perfectly captures that feeling of panic about getting older and wondering if you're running out of time to do the things you love. Throughout the show, Jonathan Larson explores the pressure artists feel, the sacrifices that come with chasing a dream, and the fear that maybe, just maybe, you're the only one who still believes in it. But at the same time, the show is also full of energy, humor, and incredible music. Songs like Why and Louder Than Words remind us that creating something meaningful is worth the struggle. And of course, a lot of people discovered the story through the film version of Tick, Tick, Boom that came out in 2021, which is how I discovered this musical. The movie really brought Jonathan Larson's story to a whole new generation of musical theater fans. And it does such a beautiful job showing just how passionate he was about his work. What makes Tick, Tick, Boom so special is that it feels incredibly real. It's not a glamorous Broadway success story. It's about the messy, stressful, uncertain journey of trying to become an artist. And honestly, that's something that a lot of us can relate to, whether we're writing music, creating podcasts, or chasing any kind of dream. I love Tick Tick Boom, and yes, I discovered it on Netflix, but I knew about Jonathan Larson for a long time because of Rent. So now, let's talk about that show that would change everything. Rent is the musical that made Jonathan Larson a legend. But what's incredible is that when he was writing it, he was still that same struggling artist we just talked about. Still waiting tables, still trying to get his big break, and still believing that Broadway could be something different. The story of Rent is actually inspired by the opera La Boheme. But Jonathan Larson moved the story to the East Village in New York City during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Instead of artists in Paris, we follow a group of young friends, musicians, filmmakers, performers who are trying to survive, create art, fall in love, and support each other while living in poverty. And what made Rent so groundbreaking was that it didn't shy away from real life. The show tackled topics that Broadway didn't talk about very often at the time. Things like the AIDS crisis, addiction, sexuality, and the struggles of young artists trying to make it in a world that often feels stacked against them. But even with those heavy themes, Rent is also full of joy, friendship, and this incredible sense of chosen family. These characters might not have much money, but they have each other. And the music is unforgettable. Songs like Seasons of Love, La Vie Boheme, and Take Me or Leave Me became instant classics. They're emotional, powerful, and full of the rock energy that Jonathan Larson always believed belonged on a Broadway stage. When Rent opened off Broadway in 1996, audiences immediately felt something special. It was raw, it was modern, and it felt like Broadway was finally speaking to a new generation. But here's the heartbreaking part of the story. Jonathan Larson never got to see the success of Rent. The night before the show's first preview performance, Jonathan Larson died suddenly from an undiagnosed aortic aneurysm. He was only 35 years old. Just think about that for a moment. The show he had poured his heart into for years was finally about to open, and he wasn't there to see it. After his death, Rent became a massive success. It moved to Broadway, won the Tony Award for Best Musical, and Jonathan Larson was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. And today, Rent is still one of the most beloved musicals of all time. It changed Broadway by proving that rock music, diverse stories, and real-life struggles belonged on that stage. Jonathan Larson wanted musicals to feel alive, urgent, and honest. And with Rent, he absolutely accomplished that. Let's talk a little bit more about the part of Jonathan Larson's story that is both heartbreaking and incredibly powerful. As I mentioned before, just as Rent was about to have its first preview performance in 1996, Jonathan Larson suddenly died from an undiagnosed aortic aneurysm. He was only 35 years old. 35. That is still so hard to think about. After years of struggling, Writing, dreaming, and believing in the show, he never got to see what it became. He never got to sit in the audience and hear people cheer. He never got to watch crowds fall in love with his music. And he never got to see how much his work would change Broadway forever. But the amazing thing is, even though Jonathan Larson wasn't there to see it, his work exploded in a way that very few shows ever do. Rent didn't just become a hit musical, it became a cultural moment. It spoke to an entire generation of people who finally saw their lives, their struggles, and their communities represented on a Broadway stage. Jonathan Larson helped prove that musicals could sound like the music people actually listen to. Rock music could belong on Broadway. Stories about young artists struggling to survive could belong on Broadway. Stories about love, loss, identity, and real human experiences could belong there too. And the influence of his work is still being felt today. Shows like Hamilton and so many other modern musicals owe something to the doors Jonathan Larson helped open. He showed that Broadway didn't have to stay stuck in the past. It could evolve, it could take risks, and it could tell new kinds of stories. Because of him, musical theater became a little more fearless. Jonathan Larson may not have lived long enough to see the incredible legacy he created, but his voice, his music, and his passion are still inspiring artists and audiences all over the world. And honestly, that might be the most powerful legacy an artist can leave behind. One of the things that makes Jonathan Larson's story so powerful is how real it feels. When you watch Tick, Tick, Boom or listen to the music from Rent, you can feel how much of himself he poured into his work. These weren't just characters he created. These were emotions and struggles he was living through in his own life. And I think that's one of the reasons his music connects with so many people. Take Seasons of Love, for example. It's one of those songs that makes you stop and really think about time, how fast it moves, and how important it is to measure your life by the things that truly matter. Love, friendship, connection. Those are the things that really count. And then when you look at Tick, Tick, Boom, the entire show is about that feeling of wondering if you're running out of time to do the thing you love. That fear of asking yourself, what if my dream never happens? I think a lot of people can relate to that. I know I can. Whether you're an artist, a writer, a musician, or honestly anyone chasing a dream, there's always that moment where you wonder if it's all going to work out. And I think Jonathan Larson's story reminds us of something really important. Keep creating anyway. Keep writing the music. Keep telling the stories. Keep doing the things that makes you feel alive. Because you never know who your work might inspire. Jonathan Larson followed his passion even when it was hard, even when success seemed far away. And because he kept going, he ended up creating something that has touched millions of people. That's the power of art. And that's the power of believing in your dream. As we wrap up today's episode, I want to go back to that question I asked at the very beginning. What if the show that changed Broadway forever opened the night after you died? That question feels almost impossible to wrap your head around. And yet, that is exactly what happened in Jonathan Larson's story. After years of writing, dreaming, and fighting for his voice to be heard, Rent was finally about to open. And he never got the chance to see the standing ovations, the awards, or the way his music would change people's lives. But in another way, that's also what makes his story so powerful. Jonathan Larson created with urgency. He wrote like every song mattered, like every story needed to be told right now. And you can feel that energy in his music, the passion, the honesty, the heart. His work reminds us that art isn't just about success or fame. It's about expression. It's about telling the truth. And sometimes it's about leaving something meaningful behind. And that's exactly what he did. Because even though Jonathan Larson isn't here anymore, his music is, his stories are, and his influence is still everywhere in musical theater today. New artists are still being inspired by the risks he took and the doors he opened. And every time someone discovers Rent for the first time, every time someone watches Tick, Tick, Boom and feels seen in that fear of chasing a dream, his voice keeps reaching new people. Jonathan Larson didn't get to see his impact, but we're still living in it. And honestly, that might be the most incredible legacy any artist could hope for. I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Music and Me. If you loved this story as much as I do, I hope you'll go listen to the music from Rent or watch Tick, Tick, Boom and experience Jonathan Larson's passion for yourself. Until next time, keep listening, keep feeling the music, and I'll see you in the next episode. Peace out, everybody. This has been the Music and Me podcast. Subscribe now so you don't miss a beat.
This has been